Because currently, if you add up all of the corporate commitments to net zero and all of the carbon removal that's required for that, that equals to multiple times today's current market of carbon removal credits available, right? So something has to change. Either supply has to increase significantly or demand has to adapt. So I think in 2027, we're going to get to a point where people are starting to realize that particularly high quality supply is actually extremely constrained and it takes time to roll it up.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, our guest is Lisett Luik, co-founder and COO of Arbonics, a tech-based carbon and ecosystem platform for nature-based carbon removal solutions, specifically focused on forests. Lisett, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to speak to you about Arbonics' work. But before we do, if you've listened to any of the episodes of the podcast before, you'll know that we also give importance to our guests' personal journey and what led them to the carbon industry. So with that in mind, I would really love it if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this space.
Of course, and thank you for having me. So I guess the very first step that took me towards forestry and forest carbon in particular was being born Estonian. Estonians are sort of forest-loving pagans, like I've heard us described. So I think by definition, half of our country is covered in forests, and we grow up spending a lot of time there. So that was the very first step. But in reality, what brought me to eventually founding Arbonics was I was actually working on the investment side. So I was working for an investment fund, and we were investing in a variety of asset classes, one of which was forest and land portfolio. And we, in general, had a climate-focused thesis for the fund. And so we were very focused on figuring out how would you invest in forestry with more than just timber as part of your thesis. So it's very easy to figure out how timber works, right? You buy a forest, you estimate, if I cut all these trees down, how much can I get for those logs? But we wanted to do a more climate-looking investment. And so we started wanting to build carbon in as a layer of value. And that led quite naturally to us trying to find the partner that would solve for that, which at the time we spent 6 months talking to anyone from small startups all the way to Goldman Sachs. And we didn't really find anyone in Europe that was solving for the sort of problem that we needed for our own portfolio. So that was how we went on to found Arbonics. And this investment fund was also where I met my now co-founder, Christian. We had an opportunity to work together before founding a company together, which is always a good testing ground.
Excellent. But what was that like, actually? What was it like to found a company that I don't imagine there's a lot of those in Estonia that focus on carbon credits in forests?
Yeah, no, there isn't. Not just in Estonia, across Europe, I think it's not very common. And so my own background is actually in sort of finance and economics. And that was the path I had. So I had a lot of learning to do on the forestry side. And Arbonics from day one, we've been very careful to work with the landowners, work with the people who are closest to the actual trees, both in literal and metaphorical terms. But I think the biggest thing that both Christian and I noticed was we saw that the carbon markets have historically struggled with transparency and, there's been outright fraud, but also just general miscalculation. And both of us coming from the world of financial services, we thought, actually, you know what, you can bring more clarity and transparency, and you can use technology in more efficient ways to make sure that the claims that are made are adequately backed up with data. So that was really the thinking we wanted to bring, sort of a more regulated approach, a clearer approach that relies heavily on data to create transparency and trust. In the same way that, if you think about the financial markets back in the 1800s, people were buying shares and they didn't really know if the company behind it existed or not, if that railroad would get built or not. And that market has been very much formalized and straightened out. And now if you buy some shares, you're pretty sure there's a real company behind it. And I think we feel like there's space to do the same for carbon credits, to give buyers the confidence that when they buy, they're really getting something that relates to real and measurable impact in the world.
Yeah, Lisett, I actually wanted to dive into more of what your business model is like, if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to sort of start at the beginning?
Yes, please do.
Of course. So at Arbonics, we are a kind of a bridge between two important or even three important parts in the voluntary carbon market. So yeah, that's the first part. We operate in the voluntary carbon market space rather than compliance carbon market. And we see ourselves as a bridge between, on one hand, landowners, so who own forests, who own empty land that could be turned into forests, that maybe historically have had a hard time accessing carbon markets because the barrier to entry is very high. And then on the other hand, you have buyers who are looking to buy high quality, trustable credits. And we see ourselves as a bridge between those two. So what we do is we sign up landowners on one hand. We use our data platform to check their land for eligibility. So we make sure that if they're joining, let's say, our afforestation project, which is planting new forests, we make sure that, their land is actually suitable for planting forests. It doesn't have protected areas. It doesn't have the kind of soil that you should actually not plant on, etc. So we check their eligibility. We do everything that is needed to make sure that they are in a legitimate carbon project. And then we make sure that they know what to plant, what trees will thrive in that location. And then on the flip side, once that's up and running, we help connect them to potential carbon credit buyers. And for the buyers, we provide them with insight into, you're not just buying an anonymous credit, you're buying afforestation-based credits from these particular plots in Latvia or Finland or Sweden. And there are birch and spruce or combinations or pine or something else growing in those particular plots. And we expect the carbon removal potential to be a certain number of credits over the period. So we're the sort of bridge between those two sides that helps connect them to each other and helps realize more afforestation in particular, because a lot of those small landowners wouldn't have been able to do it without the support of those carbon buyers.
This is such a fascinating space to me, and I have so many questions to ask based on what you said. First of which is actually, how do you go about vetting the projects? How do you choose which projects you want to support?
Yeah, this is very, very important. Again, this idea of trust and the fact that the carbon markets historically have maybe struggled with trust, but for good reason. So we do a very thorough eligibility check. So when a landowner first reaches out to us, they come to us, they let us know which land parcels they're thinking of enrolling in the carbon project. We then run this through our digital twin platform that draws on over 50 different types of data and analyzes the eligibility. So we make sure there are no legal restrictions. We make sure there are no nature protection restrictions. We make sure that this land is suitable for a carbon project under Verra rules. So we use Verra methodologies for our projects. And yeah, we were able to do that analysis actually really, really quickly. And then once they join the project, we then continue to monitor what they do and actually provide them with actionable kind of implementation advice. And here's what you should plant, here's how you should prepare the land to ensure that they do it in the most sort of the way that creates both most carbon removal, but more importantly for us, most resilient future forests.
Understood. And do I get this correctly that the MRV processes that you use, those are established by Verra?
Yeah, so we use Verra methodologies to kind of set the rules for the projects. And then we layer on top of that, obviously, like local regulation. We make sure that even if something is allowed under Verra, it also has to pass every country's individual local forest-related regulation, which in Europe is relatively strict. And I guess as a side note, that's actually why we chose to operate Arbonics in Europe rather than there's a lot of afforestation projects in other parts of the world. We thought this really strict regulatory environment would provide extra trust and security for buyers because, in Europe, if you convert land into forest, it's very difficult to then deforest it later because forestry law is quite strict. So we ensure that legal compliance as well. And then we use digital MRV tools to monitor the process as the project goes on.
Okay, fantastic. And how about verifying the credits? Is that also done by Verra, or do you rely on other verification bodies?
Today, we just work with Verra. In the future, we hope to open this up to other standards as well, as and when they become more active in the space. We picked Verra because it's still the biggest by far. But for example, they're very excited to potentially start working with the European carbon removal certification framework in the future. And we're trying to ensure that all of our projects comply with what we know of those guidelines already. So we're very much open to working with other standards in the future. But yes, today it's verified under Verra.
Okay. And so say I'm a landowner. What would my motivation be to enroll in one of your projects?
Yeah, I think there's kind of twofold. So for a landowner, especially smaller landowners, a lot of their personal sort of capital is tied up in this land. And really, historically, the only way to realize it, their house needs a new roof or they need to send their kid to university. The only way to get capital out is to cut down their trees, which is a challenging proposition because oftentimes landowners don't want to. They care a lot about the longevity of their forests. And he very much set out to provide this alternative for landowners. That was the core of what we wanted to do with Arbonics. But so, yeah, that's kind of where it comes from. Like today we have afforestation, which I've talked about in quite detail. And then we also have impact forestry, which is our solution for already existing forests, which also enable landowners to significantly delay harvest or even forego harvest entirely. And instead they will get carbon credits. So it provides them with an alternative income source that does not rely on them just cutting their forest down every time.
So at what point are the landowners compensated materially? Like, is it at the point of when the credits are issued? Is it when they're sold? Is it before all of that altogether?
So the landowners have freedom if they sign with us. So they sign with us, we take a cut of the credits generated in exchange for all of our work on the setting up the project and the ongoing verification and monitoring. And then the landowners can choose to either sell the credits themselves if they wish to, or sell through us. So in terms of compensation, it can come in two forms. It can come in the form of credits to them, which they can then sell if they want to, or they can deputize us to sell them on their behalf, in which case they will then get money. And in terms of the timelines for afforestation, plus credits usually start coming something like 5 years after planting. You need to give the trees a little time. For impact forestry, it can be as quick as 18 months after entering into this new forest management plan with us.
Okay, understood. And Lisett, you mentioned the kind of the strict regulations in Europe for forests and afforestation projects. What about legislation or policy that has to do specifically with carbon projects? Is there any such legislation in Europe that could help kind of like cultivate this environment?
Yeah, I think the big one that's upcoming is the CRCF, the European Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which essentially is the European Commission setting standards of what does high quality carbon removal look like. It includes things like afforestation, as well as, direct air capture and different other types of carbon removal. And I think what's really good about this is, so it's currently in the development phase. I think there's an expert working group working on the details on this, and they hope to launch it in 2026, I believe. But really, I think the good news for the market, it's very unusual for a startup to say that more regulation is good, but we really see this as a positive because it will set a high standard and it will kind of flush out the lower quality one. Because ultimately the goal is that if you're a buyer of carbon credits, you need to be able to trust that if you buy a ton of removal from one company versus another company, that it is somewhat equivalent and that these are comparable things. And I think today that doesn't exist in the market, but this European CRCF will drive that standardization and that confidence, which I think will be a boost to the market as a whole.
For sure. This is definitely one of the sectors that is kind of heavily anticipating more regulatory support. But since you mentioned trust and and confidence, do you guys work with carbon insurers, or do you provide any type of carbon insurance? Is that something you guys are looking into?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. So we're definitely looking into it. We haven't signed any agreements with any insurers as of today. It's still such a nascent industry that I think it's hard to figure out, what's the right risk appetite on the insurer's side, etc. So today what we do is obviously under the Verra rules, we use things like buffer credits to minimize risk. And the other part that's important for our approach is we have this sort of portfolio approach, right? Today we work with over 300 landowners. and their parcels are spread across 4 different countries. So you kind of get a natural effect of distributing risk a little bit by doing that. But at the same time, we're still conscious that there might be larger scale risks that we need to secure against. So we're very open to carbon insurance if it makes sense. But I think a lot of the offerings in the market today are still a little immature, perhaps, especially when you're looking at the long timescales that forestry involves. Things in forestry are measured in decades, not in years. And measuring risk in decades becomes quite challenging.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned that you chose Europe with a very good reason. You're focusing on Europe, but do you plan on expanding perhaps to other regions maybe in the future?
We definitely, the door is always open. We want to stick to what we know. So we know temperate forests. So if we were to expand, it would likely be along the similar latitude. So for example, it'd be unlikely for us to expand into tropical forests anytime soon. Because we're building up expertise and building up this digital twin to model out the growth of temperate forests. But I think for the next couple of years, there's so much to do in Europe. I mentioned we're in 4 markets today. We have some launches coming up. We'll expand that footprint. So I think Europe will keep us busy for a little while to go yet. So,
okay, good to know. So moving kind of to like bigger picture matters, what would you define the sector's main challenges to be right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried that I'm sounding like a broken clock, and I keep repeating myself. But really, I think it's about trust. The carbon markets have gone through periods of really rapid growth that then often have ended in like trust being broken, low quality projects being highlighted, etc. I think we've gone through another such cycle in the last couple of years. So I think one of the biggest challenges for the voluntary market is to prove that actually a lot of the criticism around are the projects additional enough, are the baselines perhaps overly generous so the estimates are overestimated. I think we need to prove that we have learned from this feedback and that the players in the market today are much, much stricter about their carbon estimates, about the durability, about the additionality. So yeah, I think solving for trust and creating more buyer confidence is one of the big challenges.
And another kind of big question I have is regarding Article 6.4. As we know, COP29 in Baku last year yielded this long anticipated approval of a international carbon markets mechanism. So my question for you is, how do you see this mechanism affecting carbon markets in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think such a good question. And I've had so many conversations since COP with many market participants about the same thing. So high level, my thinking is that there's some good news, which is an international carbon market run by the UN, agreeing that this is in fact needed and it's a net positive thing. I think that's really good. It again creates more confidence in the market participants. As almost always, the devil is in the details. So how exactly will this be implemented? What will be the rules? Who will set them? I think a lot of this is still in the works, and it's really hard to assess the full impact of 6.4 until we know the answers to those questions. But I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that I think this is absolutely a step in the right direction. And as long as the implementation details are hammered out and, everyone gets to, all of the relevant stakeholders get to have a say, I think that this could be a really good thing. But yeah, in general, COPs are challenging because as they get bigger and bigger year on year, I think the agreements tend to get more high level and then the details are often kicked down the road a little bit. It's very hard to negotiate extremely detailed regulations with such a large group of people involved.
So with that in mind, it's still rather early on in 2025, so I tend to ask this question a lot, but how do you see the rest of the year shaping up? Do you have kind of like your own personal prediction for where carbon markets are going to be headed?
Yeah. So I think one of my personal views that we share with Kristen, my co-founder, we often talk about is we think 2027 is a big inflection year, but that makes it really hard for us to predict what exactly is going to happen in 2025 or 2026, so in the short term. So we think that there's a lot of companies out there who have roadmaps either to net zero or to some sort of significant reduction in emissions that are tied to 2030. And I think when they were setting those roadmaps back in 2022, far enough in the future that you can kind of say like, okay, cool, we'll figure this out as we get closer. But as time goes, that deadline is coming ever closer. So I do think people will start having to have a strict implementation plan. Because currently, if you add up all of the corporate commitments to net zero and all of the carbon removal that's required for that, that equals to multiple times today's current market of carbon removal credits available, right? So something has to change. Either supply has to increase significantly or demand has to adapt. So I think in 2027, we're going to get to a point where people are starting to realize that particularly high quality supply is actually extremely constrained and it takes time to roll it up. Are they already realizing it this year? I'm not sure. I think there's some very sophisticated buyers, the likes of Microsoft, who have put together this symbiosis nature-based coalition. I think they're realizing that high-quality carbon removal, in order for there to be enough supply by 2030, the investments need to happen today, and therefore sophisticated buyers need to be investing in it. But has that reached every participant in the market? Probably not. I think a lot of them are going to wake up in 5 years and say, oh, wait, no, I can't afford to buy the credits I need. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah, that does sound kind of like a grim outlook. But since you mentioned the way like higher quality carbon credits rank like are more scarce, let's say, a question that came to mind just now, how do European carbon credits, like nature-based carbon credits, forest carbon credits, how do they rank on a global scale?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it depends. There's a few different metrics you could rank them on. So cost-wise, European ones are going to be more expensive. But with that comes more, that same sort of regulatory safety, I suppose, which is particularly when it comes to nature-based stuff, that those lands are protected. They're not going to get bulldozed and turned into parking lots anytime soon. So I think that that's something that stands out. Also, European forest regulations are very strict on things like not planting invasive species, only doing native species planting, making sure forests are biodiverse. And again, that's something that's not necessarily as strictly enforced in other parts of the world. So I think on the nature-based credits, you can have, for buyers who care about those criteria, such as biodiversity, permanence, durability, and low risk, European credits definitely stand out, but then they come with the price tag that matches that expectation. So for the buyers who just want a high volume of really cheap credits, they probably are not going to be the right answer. But then my personal view is that the high volume, really cheap credits are what's going to disappear from the market long term, as we realize that the impact on those is often negligible at best.
Yeah, my question was referring to the quality of the credits exactly, because pretty much if you look at any scandal that's been related to any kind of forest project, it's usually been in other places around the world, never Europe. You never really hear about Europe in this market in general, which is what kind of bred my question.
Yeah, exactly. And I bet when you talk to landowners, they probably complain that, European forestry laws are too strict. They don't let them do what they want. But I think the balance is about in the right place. So it's really about trying to balance the interests of nature versus your local communities who often heavily rely on the forestry industry. And you need to take all of that into account.
Can you provide actually examples of like the kind of co-benefits that Europe has in terms of like such forest carbon projects?
Yeah, so I think one really big group of co-benefits is all in the biodiversity space. And for us at Arbonic, we're working hard on figuring out how to better quantify that so we can, give specific numbers and not just say, hey, we're doing stuff that's good for biodiversity. But I think that's big because, again, I think a European forestry project, you can't, I'm just taking a random example, but other parts of the world, you could plant something really fast growing, but non-native, like bamboo or eucalyptus, and just plant huge plantations of just that. And this is obviously, it stores a lot of carbon, but it's quite poor in terms of biodiversity, maybe even negative. And in Europe, you cannot do that. And so by definition, you have to build this more resilient biodiverse forest, which I think is an important co-benefit. You're not just getting carbon credits, you know that these credits are good for the environment as well. I think there's other potentially things which, again, how do you measure them is a good question. But for example, you have a lot of smaller rural areas that historically have depended heavily on the timber industry and logging. And in Europe, we still have a lot of burning biomass for energy. And I think giving an alternative to those communities is an interesting co-benefit, because you're supporting the communities, and the alternative would have been not just carbon neutral, but really heavily carbon negative. So I think those are probably the two big groups. This is really biodiversity on one hand, and then the impact on those smaller local rural communities on the second hand.
Excellent. Thank you. Lastly, I also wanted to ask you if you could share with us what plans or future announcements Arbonics has lined up for the next weeks or months even.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we're really excited about. We're launching in Sweden in February. So that's a big deal for us. We're still a small company, still a young company.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And that second thing is, we've got some really exciting changes planned to our digital twin technology. First step will be actually opening part of it up to landowners. I don't know the timeline on that as specifically as I do the Sweden launch, but that's something we're excited about, is really bringing that transparency and again, in our role as the bridge, showing both sides, showing the landowners, showing the buyers. And we're actively building that. So I'm very excited. But yeah, Sweden is first up.
Fantastic. It sounds like a busy year ahead, and I really can't wait to follow up on your progress moving forward. Lisett, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to share with the world what Arbonics has been up to and how you guys are supporting forestry in Europe. It's a truly noble undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.